Hey guys, welcome back to One Shot Cophine. So tonight we're going to be reviewing the third place winner for the First Annual Fanfiction Competition. It's a one-shot by the name of I Have Been Waiting by Cophinelovin. First, a bit about the author. From my understanding, Cophinelovin is relatively new to the Cophine fic writing scene, and they just started uploading to AO3 at the end of June. Regardless of their late entry to the game, they already have 3 completed multi-chapter fics, 2 chaptered works in progress, as well as 3 one-shots, one of which is of course our featured story for tonight. That's freaking impressive. I do good to write like a chapter a week, and they're hitting all their bases. They got fluff, they got smut, they got angst. So if you've not already hit up their AO3 page, of course I highly recommend it. So pick your poison and be sure to show them some love, let them know what you think. But on to our featured story for tonight. I don't want to go too in-depth on the concept of this story. I'm going to save that gushing for after the summary. But of course, a little background is in order before I try to do this summary justice, but oh god. So I've Been Waiting is a series of 21 vignettes highlighting a specific event on one of 11 days. And the really interesting thing about this story is that we see it from both Cosima's perspective and Delphine's perspective, and each vignette alternates between the two. But in the beginning, we start with Delphine's perspective, and it's like December 3rd, 2020, and she wakes up and she's thinking about how she's going to marry Cosima that day, which is a wonderful way to start a Cophine fic, let me tell you. But I digress. The very next vignette we see is Cosima's perspective, and it's dating all the way back to August 3rd of 2013 when Delphine notices Cosima for the first time. And of course, you know, Cosima's noticed her a million times and never quite had the stones to say anything, and she's thinking that she has to introduce herself. And so from then on we have alternating vignettes. It goes back to Delphine and back to Cosima, and as the story progresses, the days we see from Delphine's perspective are going backwards in time, whereas the days that we see from Cosima's perspective are going forward. And of course they overlap in the middle, and then the days we originally saw from Delphine's perspective, we are seeing from Cosima's perspective, and vice versa. So the days we saw from Cosima's perspective, we're seeing from Delphine's, continuing to go backwards. Dear God, I hope that makes sense. For the sake of my sanity, I'm going to summarize the story in chronological order. So as I said, the earliest date we see in the story is April 3rd of 2013. It picks up with Cosima sitting in the lab, and she notices Delphine over in the corner talking to Scott. And so she's just kind of admiring her from afar, and Delphine looks over and notices her staring. Cosima panics and just kind of knocks over a cup of coffee while Delphine's chuckling to herself and thinking about how cute she thinks Cosima is. It's a brief meeting, but of course these are vignettes, so... The next day that we see is about 2 weeks later, and it's April 18th. And here we see both Cosima and Delphine ruminating over their first actual interaction, where Cosima was running late to class and she come around the corner and almost ran smack into Delphine. So after introducing themselves, Delphine invites Cosima out for coffee, which of course Cosima enthusiastically accepts, quote unquote. In which of course Cosima then, with the help of some alcohol, texted Delphine the next day asking her to go out to dinner, and so they're both getting ready for their date. And then from Delphine's perspective here, we also learn that she kind of intentionally ran into Cosima, which I really love that. And then the next day is October 18th of 2013. And if you're reading this without paying attention to the dates, you would probably immediately think that we're seeing them at their first date because they're both, you know, entering a restaurant. But as we go into it, even without looking at the date, we learn it's 6 months later, they've been dating, they're just head over heels for one another, and at the end of it, we get to see them exchange I love yous for the first time. So the next day that we see is May 12th, 2014. So we've skipped another significant amount of time, and Cosima and Delphine have been together for over a year at this point. And what I really love about this day in particular is we get two very contrasting perspectives, because Cosima is ecstatic. She just found out she got accepted into the PhD program at Berkeley. We learned that they're getting ready to graduate in a couple of weeks, and so they've already talked about it, and Delphine's going to go with her to California, and they're going to live together and start their lives together. But then, as Cosima's going to meet Delphine, we see from Delphine's perspective that Delphine gets a phone call, finds out that her mother is sick, and she's going to have to go back to France to take care of her. So she's going to have to leave Cosima. And of course, once Cosima meets with her in the quad, Delphine shares the news immediately and tries to remain stoic while Cosima cries and tries telling her, you know, everything's going to be fine, it'll be okay, we'll try long distance. But we all know, in the words of Cosima in canon, long distance never works. So the next day jumps forward in time all the way to July 12th of 2018. So we've lost like 4 years. And we see that from Delphine's perspective, she's sitting at her mother's bedside and they're getting ready to take her mother off life support. And then when her mother finally goes, Delphine expresses relief at feeling, free for the first time without the burden of her mother's illness. And from Cosima's perspective, we see that she has a new girlfriend, fucking Shay. But all is well because she's thinking, today's the day I have to leave her. I have to break up with Shay. So bless this day in this post because I'm sorry, but I hate Shay. Well, sorry, not sorry. But anyway, Cosima resolves that she has to leave Shay because she thought she could love her, but it never did come to pass. The next day we see is special in that it's the only day we see from a third-person perspective. It takes place on August 20th of 2018, so it's about a month after Cosima leaves Shay and Delphine loses her mother. And Delphine is calling Cosima for the first time in 4 years. She explains to Cosima that her mother died, and she tells her, I want to come back to California, which of course takes Cosima very off guard. And Delphine goes on to say that she wants to see Cosima and kind of quote-unquote catch up, to which Cosima agrees. Which leads us into the next day we see, which is December 10th, 2018. So it's been a few months, but Delphine finally comes back to the States. So she and Cosima are meeting up again for the first time after all these years have passed. And she goes over to Cosima's house, and when they first see each other, they embrace. And from both perspectives, we see how that embrace isn't awkward, it's just warm and familiar. From Delphine's perspective, we learn that she talks and talks and talks while Cosima listens to her. And while Cosima's listening, she's thinking about how she doesn't hold any bitter feelings, but she's not really sure what she wants as far as Delphine goes. But she does know that she wants Delphine in her life in some way. She just doesn't specifically know what yet. Fortunately, it doesn't really take too long for Cosima to figure that out, because the next vignette we see takes place on December 31st of 2018, so it's the end of the year. From Cosima's perspective, we see that she gets invited to a New Year's Eve party at her friend's house. And because Delphine doesn't know that many people in California yet, she invites Delphine as well. And so the two spend the evening together, lost in their own little world, and they kiss at the stroke of midnight. And just as Delphine is thinking about how she still loves Cosima, Cosima tells her the same thing, which is totally romantic. And so I think it's safe to say that our girls are back together. Fortunately for our shipper hearts, the rest of the story seems to be smooth sailing. The next day we see is May 6th of 2019, so about 6 months later. Cosima and Delphine are on a date. Cosima is taking Delphine to see the Golden Gate Bridge because Delphine has never seen it before. And while they're out just enjoying an absolutely beautiful day, Cosima asks Delphine if she will move in with her, to which Delphine agrees instantly. After that, the story picks up on September 1st of 2019. And Delphine has taken Cosima to Cosima's favorite spot in San Francisco. And it's a street that kind of overlooks the rest of the town. And they stay there and watch the sunset. And Delphine says she doesn't want any more lost time between the two of them and asks Cosima to marry her. And you can only guess what Cosima said. Of course, yes. Which brings us to our final day, October 3rd, 2020, which is actually the entry that starts the entire story off. So we have Delphine waking up ecstatic that she's marrying Cosima that day. We finally see Cosima's point of view, where she's thinking about seeing Delphine for the first time in her dress and how gorgeous she thinks Delphine is and how she feels like she could just fly away. And the story concludes with Cosima thinking that she's home, they're home, and that it was worth the wait. And thus, that concludes my summary. So I have several things to say about this fic. First of all, it is a fluff reader's wet fucking dream because you get everything. You get their initial meeting, you get a little bit of angst for the breakup, but not really much. You get to see Shay get broken up with, so haha. Then you get to see them coming back together. Their first I love yous, their I love you once they're reunited. Cosima asking Delphine to move in with her. Delphine asking Cosima to marry her. The wedding. I mean, all that's missing is like Cophine with kids, if that's your thing. And it's just adorable. This whole thing was adorable. And of course, I loved it, so. What really blew me away about this fic, though, was the way in which it was written. So I know the summary says that the concept for this story comes from the musical The Last 5 Years, but I know nothing about that musical, so I don't really know what was borrowed from it. But either way, just having Delphine's perspective and seeing it go back in time as the days go by, and then having Cosima's perspective in contrast going forward in time, and then having that overlap in the middle, and then seeing the same days from the other person's point of view, I think was the most genius fucking thing ever. And it was just like mesmerizing to me. I'm like, who thinks to do this? This is fantastic. So I really, really love that. And I especially love that because we're seeing future events interlaced with past events, you have Cosima talking about all these happy things like their first date and telling each other they love each other on their 6-month anniversary. And then at the same time in between these, you have Delphine talking about seeing each other for the first time in 4 years and wondering if Cosima will still look the same and talking about getting back together. And so you're left wondering what happened because it's so much darker at first from Delphine's perspective. And I'm one of those people that if I see a spoiler for something, like I knew Delphine was going to die in season 3 all the way back in season 1 because I got into the fandom so late. But it didn't ruin it for me because I was like, what led up to this? What happened? How did this come about? And so seeing Delphine talking about like them being broken up and Cosima talking about all these happy things, and I'm like, what happened? What am I missing? And so it just like really made me want to get through this story and find out all these missing pieces and get the whole story. And I love the way that it draws you in that way. It gives you just enough so that you want to keep reading and you want to keep going and find out what's happening. And then meeting in the middle, finding out what's happening, them getting back together, and then getting to see all of the events that you've seen before from the other person's vantage point is just glorious. I loved it. I will never get over the concept of this story. I'm sorry. Also, because of the way this fic was written, we see 2 different perspectives. And I think all of the other contest entries were written either in first person or third person, which, of course, with the exception of You're Loving Jack, you do see Delphine's perspective in the final letter at the end. But this one, you have alternating points of views. So the thing I've always just been fascinated by is when you write from a different perspective, you have to write with a different voice, because Cosima's thinking is going to be different than Delphine's. And though it's not very pronounced, I do love the subtle things in this story. Like when you see it from Cosima's perspective and she's looking at Delphine and she's like, she's sexy as hell. That's so Cosima's manner of speaking, whereas Delphine seems to be a little bit more elegant, her insides exploding like thousands of tiny fireworks, as it says. It just a little more graceful than what Cosima's thinking might be. But at the same time, personally, I feel like Cosima and Delphine's thinking would still be rather similar because they're both on such a high intellectual level. It would just be more of a cultural thing for me, probably. But I do love the subtle differences that you see between their perspectives as far as narrative style goes. And then also the way we see each day from Cosima's point of view and Delphine's point of view. Another thing that I was really impressed by is the way in which each perspective parallels the other so well. Like, for example, the day at which they're out to dinner for their 6-month anniversary. From Delphine's perspective, she thinks something along the lines of, Cosima kept running her thumb over her hand throughout the night. And then from Cosima's perspective, which, takes place at a much different place in the story because of how it's written, Cosima talks about how she couldn't keep her hands off of Delphine's throughout the entire dinner. And I feel like all of the entries kind of play off each other in that way. Though they take place at very separate times, like you have Delphine's thoughts on the wedding day at the very beginning versus Cosima's thoughts on the wedding day at the very end, they still play off one another. And it feels so in sync, which I thought was executed wonderfully. Of course, I do have to mention the way in which this fic filled the prompt of lost time, which I feel is kind of obvious here. Not only were the small gaps of lost time in between where we see the different stages of their relationships, there's that heartbreaking 4-year gap when they're separated and they've not even had any contact and they've both tried to move on but were totally unsuccessful. And it fits so well with the way this entire story was written and fulfilled the prompt nonetheless. But with that said, I think I'm going to finish up with my favorite quote and my favorite moments. My favorite moment was probably the phone call in the very middle of the story, just because it's, that late night phone call where your whole world's about to change, and just something about that idea has always really resonated with me. So I think hands down that's probably my favorite point in this. And then my favorite quote is, you're going to think I'm really weird, but it's actually on May 12th from Cosima's perspective at the very last line of the paragraph where she says, "We will try long distance." It's something about it just gets that line stuck in my head. It's just so matter of fact, like, we will try long distance. And it just seems, I don't know. I don't really know how to explain it. It's just like that one sentence holds so much weight. And then, of course, follow it up with the fact that the next vignette we see from Cosima's perspective is 4 years in the future and she's with another woman, and it just kind of gives it more power. But alright guys, so that's going to be all for this review. I am so freaking sorry that this has taken so long. I start back to school in like less than 2 weeks, so I'm gonna get the last contest entry done before I go back, I promise. But life has gotten insane all of a sudden. So thank you so much for your patience, and thanks again for listening in. If you've not already checked out this story, or if you have, do head on over to AO3 and let Cophinelovin know what you think and check out some more of their work. But again, thanks for listening, and until next time.